Let's look at another game, this time the trust game. It involves two players. One of them is endowed with 10 euros, and this person can decide to share money with another person. The important bit is that the money that they share will be multiplied. So, for instance, in this case, it'll be quadrupled. If I take my 10 euros and I send all of that money to the other person, they will have 40. Now, the other person can decide if they want to keep some amount of that 10 euros to themselves and then return the rest. So the fair thing to do would be to keep 20 and to return another 20 to the first player. Now, why is this situation interesting? Because the first player has to basically trust that the second player, whom we call the trustee, that the second player will give back these 20 bucks, right? So the trustor, the first player, has to invest some trust, because the trustee, the second person, they might as well just keep the 40 euros to themselves, right? If they keep the 40 euros, then the original person, the trustor, just gets nothing. So, and this is why it's an interesting situation to study how people will interact in these trust games. Okay, that all sounds pretty cool, right? And it sounds like pretty straightforward that actually these incentivized decisions, they should be, pretty much the gold standard, shouldn't they? I want to point you to one piece of research that actually calls into question whether studying prosocial behavior or cooperation like this actually makes sense. Or like produces, surely it makes sense, but if it produces valid conclusions. So this piece of research, here's what they did. Participants played 3 economic games, and you can see 2 of them were a version of the prisoner's dilemma that we originally discussed. And the 4th one was a stag hunt game, and you can read the details here, but they don't really matter a lot. What matters is that these were games about cooperation. And what was interesting about the design is that the partner in this game, these are all 2-player games, so you make a choice and then another person makes a choice and then there's an outcome. The partner was either present in the room, that means their choices actually had an effect, or this was a partner from a previous experiment, so their choices would have no effect because me being nice to that person doesn't help them anymore. They've already left, they're not going to get paid for it. So what should we see? Or rather, what do we see? So we find that, this is from the text, that cooperation rates are slightly lower without a human counterpart in all games. However, the difference is small and statistically insignificant. So what we should see is that if people play against the phantom, as it's called here, they shouldn't cooperate as much, right? They shouldn't care about the outcomes of the phantom. They should just exploit the phantom, because there's no rule that says you have to be nice to someone who's not even going to benefit from it. But people still actually cooperate even with the phantom. And that might suggest that social preferences are not necessarily captured well in these games. So actually this throws some shade on the idea that we can simply capture real behavior in these small economic games, that we can bring real life behavior into the lab. Now, what might be a solution for it? A solution for it might be to take a look at what people are actually doing in the real world. So to really look at field studies where people deal with real money that they actually have earned themselves, and not just a 10 euro decision in the laboratory. Okay, but now we've talked about cooperation for a whole lot, and we haven't spoken about incentivized decisions in moral psychology. Remember that we talked about the trolley dilemma? Well, that's probably a good reason why there isn't a lot of incentivized decisions research in moral psychology. Because that would mean we put people in a situation where there's a trolley loose on a train tracks and people's lives are at stake. Of course, and obviously we can't do that. But there is some research that actually looks at moral goods that are real. So one of these examples is a study by Falk and Check in 2013, where the lives of excess lab mice was at stake. So how did this study work? In research, often we do testing on mice. For not we as psychologists, we rarely do this, although there is some psychology that deals with mice. But for instance, in medical research, mice are just incredibly needed because we need to test medication, test operations, and so on and so forth. So that means there are lab mice that are bred expressly for that purpose. And sometimes they're leftover lab mice because they haven't been used for the purpose that they were intended. And these excess lab mice are then actually killed in a rather humane way. Now, if the degree to which this is humane, you may want to debate, and this is not up to me to decide. But so this happens anyway. This happens in real life. This goes on. And participants in this study had the option of saving the life of one of these lab mice. So instead of them going as per definition, they would be killed, participants could choose to save them. And they could choose whether either to receive 10 euros or to save the life of a lab mouse. And then the mice would go and live their life happily ever after in a mouse farm in Italy, actually. So this was the real decision. And of course, that means that the mice really were saved. So we have technically an incentivized decision with a moral good, the life of a mouse. So, and in this study, actually, what Falk and Check did was to contrast this situation where participants decided on their own whether they wanted 10 euros or to save the life of a lab mouse. They contrasted this situation with the amount that people would accept to forgo saving the life of the mouse in a bi- or multilateral market. So they basically looked at whether when we trade with others about a moral good, in this case, mice, in a market, if this erodes our morals, and that's exactly what they found. So the price accepted, if there was a trade involved, was actually lower than the price accepted for the life of a mouse if people were just on their own. Yeah, so this is an example for studying moral psychology questions with real life decisions. And it's not the only one. So this is a recent trend that moving towards incentivized decisions. So there is some research done with donations to purchase food for orphans as a moral good. There's some research done with paying for leprosy operations, for instance. Or actually my favorite one is probably one where some charities of either foreign or indigenous animals, I think otters and hedgehogs, is at stake to study intergroup behavior. So it's one of my one of my favorites. Right, but these are examples of incentivized decisions that have something to do with moral psychology. I now want to change the topic very slightly and talk about truth as a moral virtue and as a moral good. And for this, we can consult some research methods, for instance, the die in the cup paradigm. And it goes like this. So participants are given a die and a cup to cover it with, and then they shake the cup and the die inside, and then they are the only person who can see what number they rolled on this die, because there's a little hole in the top, but no one else, so the experimenter or anyone else, can actually see this. But, and here's a twist, participants are paid in accordance with the number that's shown on the die. So if you roll a high number, you get more money. If you roll a low number, you get less money. Clearly, there's an incentivization to lie, right? If you don't have to worry that anyone else is going to see it, but if you lie, you're going to get more money. So there's also a fun twist where this game now becomes a question of cooperation, because consider embedding the game like this, as was done in a 2015 study, where there are two players, and first player A privately rolls a die, So, and then looks through the top, and then reports the outcome. And then player B learns about A's report, and player B then gets to roll their die and reports the outcome, and then player A learns about B's report. So, and then now the twist again with the payoff. If the two people report the same outcome, so the same number on the face of their die, then they both receive the reported amount in euros. So again, it's good for me to lie to get more points. So saying I have a 6 is better than saying I have a 5. But the other person has to match it. And if the reported outcomes are not equal, we both get nothing, right? So what would we assume? Well, if we assume that people are being honest, then we should see, here's just some simulated data, because these are random events, right? We should see that sometimes these reports match, sometimes they don't. Sometimes player A gets a 6, sometimes player A gets a 1. But if we compare this simulated data with the actual reported data, we can see that actually people lie in this game. So people lie both in the sense that suddenly we see many more matches, and we see many more 6s than we should expect. And if we take a look at patterns of lying, here's some fun examples. So in example A, we can see player A's report, those are the circles, and player B's reports, those are the X's. So here we just have two players who always rolled a 6, and then the other person also rolled a 6. So that's just an example of just perfect liars, brazen liars. In example B, we can see that player A, they were also going for the strategy. They were also saying, okay, I have a 6 all the time. But player B was actually an honest person. So player B reported the actual outcomes. In option C, we have player A being an honest person and reporting the outcomes that they rolled. And then player B being kind of clever and saying, well, I always match what you say. So even though player A wanted to be honest, player B tricked them into gaining a lot of money by just always always matching. And then here's a fun example of actually communication between players in example number D, where player A started with always reporting 4 and player B always matched that, except for round 6, I believe, where player B just actually sacrificed the outcome for that round to signal to player A to please go higher, to signal, okay, go for a 6. We can do the same thing. You report a 6 and then I match it, but just go up. And then you can see player A wasn't quite that brazen. Instead of going for a 6, they went for a 5. Okay, so but also these are incentivized decisions, and they have something to do with moral behavior because they have to do with truth telling. If we overall think about what we kind of our opinion about incentivized decisions, we could say that non-hypothetical or incentivized choices are more externally valid because they have more to do with our real life behaviors than with the kind of abstract scenarios that we talked about in the stage before, and they also produce a little bit less noise in the measurement. So that's why now we would often consider them the golden standard for behavioral outcomes. But I've already foreshadowed that, again, there might be some issues involved. For instance, that in cooperation, people try to cooperate with a phantom even though there's no one there. And then whether it really matters if you have $10 or not, or like the degree to which you were willing to share it there as compared to real life decisions. It might not be the perfect way to capture behavior. So that now often people are also turning to look to field work